Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Humanities Cafe. My name is Stacy with the South Dakota Humanities Council, and I welcome you. We are in for a great program today. The Lakota New Year will begin on Saturday, April 12th, which is the first full moon following the vernal equinox, and this date in turn marks the beginning of the Lakota calendar. Based on the lunar calendar, which is a calendar based on the monthly cycles of the moon's phases, as well as ancient explorations of the Lakotan universe and oral tradition, referred to most commonly as Lakota Star Knowledge. The Lakota calendar may not be familiar to most non-Indigenous people and may not resemble what mainstream society would typically view as a calendar per se, but the significance and importance of Lakota Star Knowledge for mainstream society can't be overstated, particularly in terms of modern science and technology. And that's what we're going to dig into today. I'm honored, extremely honored, and grateful to have with us today two notable guests who can speak to the importance of Lakota Star Knowledge. I have Dr. Craig Howe, a Lakota scholar and founder and director of the Center for American Indian Research and Native Studies, also known as CAIRNS, and Caitlin Bordeaux, a STEM educator who recently completed an internship, with NASA. So I'm super excited. Welcome, Dr. Howe, Caitlin. Please take a moment to further introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit more about your interests and background. Caitlin, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'll go first. Hello, everybody. Yeah, thank you for that introduction. I grew up on the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota, and I'm Sicangu Lakota, and I taught for a couple years there, and then also over on the Pine Ridge Reservation in Oglala lands at Lakota Tech High School. So got some experience with yeah, two different areas in teaching, and also grew up in Rosebud and got my education there as well. And right now I'm in a PhD program in STEM education at the University of Minnesota, and still exploring that connection between star knowledge and STEM education, and different ways we can support our youth in that way.
Wonderful.
I'll pass it over to you, Craig.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Stacy, for inviting me to be here. It's great to be a part of this. As you can see, I'm on the road and in Chadron, Nebraska right now, but parked in front or beside the Bean Broker, and we're using their Wi-Fi. So if you get to Chadron, be sure to buy some coffee here. But yeah, so I grew up in Pine Ridge Reservation and went to school in Martin, grade school and high school in Martin, and then went on to higher education, and then moved back about 25 years ago to South Dakota, to Rapid City then, and then out to Wing Springs, this place that I'm building and where the Center for American Indian Research and Native Studies is located. And yeah, so that's my little trajectory. I'm getting to be an old man now.
Well, I'm excited to have you both. So let's start off. Can you share with us an explanation of what Lakota Star Knowledge entails or refers to? Dr. Howe, do you want to start?
Sure. So Lakota Star Knowledge would any narratives. So the way we do it, I would say, so these are the traditional narratives tied to the astronomy as broadly speaking as we can. So not just stars. So, and a lot of times now we're starting to use Lakotan astronomy, so as a knowledge system based on Lakotan purposes, but it can deal with the sun and the stars as well.
Okay, and why are they why are star narratives particularly vital to understanding Indigenous beliefs and lifeways?
Well, so again, just kind of terminologically, we'd say for the Lakotan star knowledge is not vital for maybe too many peoples other than Lakotans. And we can operate as Lakotans without knowing that knowledge. But as with any knowledge system, it has information that can be useful in ways that we don't know. So we do think it's important to perpetuate and to study this Lakotan astronomy, just to understand it better. We don't know what the consequence. I think sometimes of like when NASA sent, the moon, the astronauts to the moon, you know, we end up with tang and freeze-dried food out of that and a lot of other technologies, but that wasn't the intended outcomes, the only intended outcomes of that initiative to go to the moon.
Okay, and I think it's important to point out, from my perspective too, there's not a lot of research that someone like me can actually do, because so much of Lakota Star knowledge is based on oral tradition, and that's so important. When I was reading and doing my preliminary research into this, I found it interesting to the perspective of as above, so below, that everything in the heavens is reflected on the earth, and the relationship of how, you know, we're all related, and it's not just relatives in terms of two-leggeds, it's all nations, the four-leggeds, the star nation, the winged nation. Can you speak a little bit more about that as an indigenous scholar? Explain that to us.
So
Did
I
I put
guess
you on the spot?
I wanna make it a distinction that what it is based in oral tradition, what we call it, we have these narratives. All societies had oral traditions at the beginning. That's universal. So it's not unique to Lakotans or native peoples to have that situation. I learned and know what I know by research and what's published. So just because something is in the oral tradition, that's not how I did it. Just same way as
Okay.
you did, and almost anyone in this day and age, we do the work. We do the intellectual work of finding sources and reading them and critically evaluating them. And that's, for instance, one thing, this what's above, below, we just cannot find that in a real strong, say, scholarly basis for that in the literature.
Okay.
And a lot of what we find is not very accurate, we don't think, and we've worked on this for maybe 30 years or more, that it's the status quo or the stereotype of American Indians, and sometimes indigenous is the term they use now. We don't care about indigenous star knowledge. We are concerned with Lakota star knowledge.
Okay.
And these are all different. Each of them have each of these tribes or peoples have their own knowledge systems, and we need to respect that. And so
Absolutely.
yeah, some people have said there's this what's above is below, kind of this hourglass figure. There's only one constellation, Gemini, that it looks like that could be applicable, but basically nothing else.
Okay. So let's start off. Some of the stories that I've read are just amazing to me. So, as a Lakota scholar and someone who's very familiar with the oral tradition, Dr. Howe, can you share a few examples about some of these star narratives? I'm particularly fascinated in the story of the Big Dipper and some other ones. So, what are the most pertinent Lakota star narratives that could relate to mainstream modern science?
Well, so they're not intended to be relating to mainstream
Right,
modern
right.
science. So uh, it's putting these traditional knowledge systems at a disadvantage by the question. And
Okay, and
so
I apologize for that.
yeah, no, and that's fine, but I just want to make it clear that the intention of Lakotan astronomy is to serve Lakotan
Right,
society at that time. When we're talking about this, we're saying some period before now, right? And before immigrants came, let's say.
right.
So pre-reservation days. This is where what these narratives, when they were recorded, and the
Mhm.
societies they were serving at that time. So they're not useful if we want to build a space rocket or we want to talk about supernova and all these type of things. There weren't telescopes. They were basing
Mhm.
this off of naked eye astronomy and naked eye observation, that served all their purposes. So it's a challenge. What we think is that all knowledge systems has these values that are not tied in these potentials that are not tied to time and place. And so by others, let's say modern science or other traditions, studying these, maybe they'll see something that'll spark something, and they'll look at the stars or constellations or space and time, I don't know, in a different way. But we don't, that's not our purpose for studying these, and then trying to articulate them as best we can for Lakotans and also for non-Lakotans.
Okay, so in looking at it, can you tell us the story about the Big Dipper and how that relates to the Ocheti Shakoi? Because that I found that to be fascinating, and it made me look at it in a little bit different way.
So, and again, so our working assumption is there were other narratives. All we can do is research what the ones that were fortunate enough to get recorded.
Mhm.
So the one I guess about the Big Dipper, Wichakiuhapi is the name of that in Lakotan, and that's I guess we just say those. If you think about the Big Dipper, there's the 4 stars that make the bowl, and then there's the 3 stars that are the handle. And the narratives say that those 4 stars are called the carriers. And these are when a Lakotan person dies, their spirit, Wanahi, goes to is carried to the Milky Way, and it's carried by those 4 stars in the bowl of the Big Dipper. And Biko, who recorded some of these, said that sometimes those are horsemen, so they're riding horses with a blanket between them, carrying that spirit. And other times it's people on feet carrying a blanket with the spirit between them. And then those other 3 stars, the handle, are the mourners following them. And so they take this spirit to the Milky Way, and then that spirit travels the Milky Way from the north to the south. And when it gets to the south, then it returns to a star. That's where that spirit comes from, is a star. When a Lakotan is born, this spirit, they acquire this spirit from a star, and then at the end, this spirit returns. Now, what we don't know, or it's not clear, if the spirit goes back to that same star or if it just goes to a star. But that's this cycle and this importance of the Big Dipper in traditional Lakotan society.
Thank you, and I think it gives us a beautiful way to look at astronomy in a more, I don't know, meaningful way for all of us. The other one that I found most interesting is the story about why the North Star never moves. Can you kind of briefly tell us that story?
Yeah. So again, what's neat is they were astute observers. Lakotans were, and I think most people's prior to cities with a lot of lights and everything. I mean, that's what you have for a half of your life is night skies. So they noticed that one star didn't move, and from from the narrative that we have, the reason that star doesn't move is that star had married a Lakotan woman, and we have her name. Her name was Tapun Shawin, red cheek woman. And she was a Lakotan woman. We don't know which of the Oyates, but she was from a Lakota Oyate, and then this stranger came and courted her, and she was wooed by him. So as they got married, and he took her back to his people in the sky, and then and soon she was pregnant, and she was lonely in a way, but everything was exciting. But her husband, as all stars do, they have to go and leave and travel, and they're moving all the time, and she was alone a lot of the time. And when she was close to giving birth, she seen a plant one time when she was walking up there that looked kind of like a timsala, which grows down here. And so she wanted to taste that. So she dug up that timsala. And when she did, she could see there was a hole through the sky, and she could see down to the earth, and she could see her Lakotan relatives. And wow, then she was really lonely. So then she braided everything together to try to return to her people. And the narrative says she didn't, it wasn't long enough, her rope. And so she ended up having to let go, and she fell and died. But her husband, when he came back, he looked for his wife. Then he seen that hole, and he looked through, and he could see that she had fallen and died. And It just says he walked a little ways and sat down, and he's never moved since then. And Wichachpi Owangila, he just stays in that one place, and that's the North Star.
Thank you. I love that. I absolutely love that story. And the last one I found really interesting was well, there's a lot of them, but I liked the story of the fallen star and Devil's Tower. If you could just entertain us or inform us on that one last story, and then we'll move on, I promise.
All right, good. So when that Tapun Shanwin fell to the earth and died, miraculously her baby was born, and that baby was raised by an elderly Lakotan woman, and she named him Wichachpi Henkpaya, Fallen Star. And he grew up to be like a superhero to Lakotans. And at some point, when he was a teenager, he said he wanted to go back to his father's people in the sky. But he's told the Lakotans, he said, now you're my relatives and I'll help you with medicines and with natural disasters. And then he left. But sometime then and we don't know which Lakota Oyate, but the Lakotans were returning from the northwest, and they were coming back towards the Black Hills, and they stopped to camp, and that's when the men went out hunted, the women were setting up the lodges, and the kids were all playing. And this group of girls, there were 7 of these girls, they went and they kept playing and getting further and further away from the people, and all at once they had that sense that they were being watched or something, and they stopped and they looked, and the Lakota narrative says they were surrounded by bears that were going to eat them. And so they were afraid and they yelled, but either the people were too far away to come help, or the people were so far away they couldn't hear them. But anyway, those bears started coming in to kill them, and at the last moment, this a voice came out of the blue sky, and it just said to those girls, stand up on this little mound. And so they did, but that startled those bears, and they all stopped. And so those girls had time to get on that mound, and then that voice said to that mound, rise up. And so that it started rising up, and those bears then got their senses again and started charging in to eat those girls. And as that mound was rising up, it just was faster than those bears, and it says they were clawing at the sides of that mound that went up, and huge spires of stone fell off that mound and killed all those bears, all of them. But that kept going up till it ended up high up in the air. And then the narrative, which a lot of time people don't know that ending of it, was then that voice was Wichachpi Hinkpaya, Fallen Star. And so he asked each girl what their favorite bird was, and then each of them named a different species, and then a flock of those birds came and carried that girl back to her family. So in this narrative, the Lakotan girls are returned to their family. Other tribes' narratives, those girls go and become the Pleiades or some other group of stars in the sky. So that's how, and that place where that happened is called Mato Tipila in Lakotan, the Bear Lodge, Lodge of the Bears. But in English, it's called Devil's Tower.
And I thought, like, looking at the topography of that landmass, you see the claw marks and you see the rocks around the bottom, and it's so cool how it just relates. So I promised that was the last one I was going to ask you to share. I do want to tell everybody, Dr. Howe is at the Center for American Indian Research and Native Studies, and I'm going to put the link in the chat because I have read this book that I got from Dr. Howe, and it is so interesting. It's called Tender Reference. And it's about Lakota Star Knowledge. There's a lot of research and resources you can get from them. And I highly recommend it because I have the collection now, and I'm making my way through it. So moving forward with this portion of the conversation, then, what is the purpose? What was the purpose in Lakota, ancient Lakota ways for watching the movements of the night sky? How did that come about? I mean, the knowledge of the celestial calendar was important for survival, right?
I'm not sure if it's necessary for survival as far as the celestial calendar. The other publications, or another publication, will talk about the constellations being a timekeeper, and that Lakotans would have this yearly cycle tied to constellations. We can find no collaborating evidence to support that. And it just sometimes with good intentions, it kind of negates the agency or the intelligence of Lakotans. If somehow all they did was follow a certain constellation around, it doesn't say anything about their creativity or their agency. So but based on evidence, we cannot find that strongly supported in the literature. So Lakotans were not guided by the stars. We can find very little about that. But I think one of the neat things is in the northern plains, life is tenuous. The death is always right close to you, weather-wise, and all the things that can happen in the droughts and all these type of things. So Lakotans, one of the ways Lakotans tried to mitigate that unpredictability was by making relatives, making relations with all the nations, the trees and the fruits and the grasses and the buffaloes and all the animals and the stars. As we've seen, a Lakotan woman married a star. And so these are relatives up there. So this idea of once someone's a relative, you don't know they'll treat you well, but you can predict they will. And you can, at least you can count on them, or you can count on asking them to help you. And if they can, they should. But sometimes for whatever reason, they're busy or they don't want to, they won't help you, but it mitigates some of that unpredictability. So I think that's one way of looking at this astronomy system from a Lakotan perspective, is that these are relatives. They'll help us if we need them. And also, I think if half of your life is spent looking at them, it's nice to think of them as being kin. Somehow you have a personal relationship with all those peoples up there.
Okay. And I have something that you had given to me with the moons, the Lakota moons.
Yep.
And so I'm hoping you could speak to us on the significance of the night sky in terms of the moon phases, like and that like equinoxes and solstices included. But sometimes there's 12 and sometimes there's 13. Can you share a little bit about that with us?
Yeah, so Lakotans the moon was primary, and so solstices and equinoxes had no consideration. We have no evidence that Lakotans understood equinoxes or solstices. That's again something I always like to blame the hippies for that. I don't know if it was them or not, but anyway, moons is the key thing. Solstices and equinoxes are about sun. So what we know is, like, for instance, sun dances were determined by a full moon, not by a solar solstice in that case. The beginning of the year was determined by a full moon when the ducks return, not because it's near the equinox, right? So and it's a way to calibrate between a solar system, like what a Gregorian calendar, and a lunar system, like the Lakotan calendar, or say, and holidays that are based on lunar, like Ramadan, right? These are holidays that to us seem strange because they keep moving backward through the calendar. And that's what happens if you don't somehow calibrate it to the solar year. And so that's what happens when the ducks return. The full moon nearest to when the ducks return is the beginning of the Lakotan year. Has nothing to do with it doesn't have intentionally anything to do with the the spring equinox, but when the ducks return is in the spring, so it's going to be near what we also know is the vernal equinox, the spring equinox. So yeah, and so just why a fact of the moon, the cycles of the moon, the circuits of the moon in relation to the sun, is that every third year basically is when there'll be 13 full moons in a calendar year. And again, it's just like the solar system, what we do in the Gregorian calendar, right? Every 4 years we have a leap day, and so forth. There's all these ways to kind of calibrate these calendars. It's just none of them seem to line up perfectly with the same time at the same place where the Earth is in an annual cycle.
Okay. So with all of this information, I'm going to open it up. I know I'm imagine that people have questions or comments. It's wide open. Who wants to ask a question or provide some information? You could, if you don't want to speak up, you can also place your question in the comments or in the chat, excuse me. Nobody's curious? Okay, well, we're going to move forward a little bit then. So we're going to shift a little bit now over to the main topic, I think, of what I wanted to address with this discussion is what is the relationship between Lakota Star Knowledge and modern space science? So, and like, you know, I noticed that and when I was reading about it, really wasn't until 2014 with the Smithsonian exhibition when they were doing there's a Lakota Winter Counts exhibition at the Smithsonian, and they noticed that the year the stars fell, which is on every Lakotan calendar apparently, was actually indicative of the year 1833 Leonid meteor shower. And then they were like, oh wait, there's something here. So how does Lakota Star Knowledge, what's the relationship with modern space science? Caitlin, do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, sure. I think for me too, I just love listening to Dr. Howe in this approach too, because it's something like I've always wondered about too, like within my research, a lot of it comes from, you know, stories and what we find in textbooks. But I think one of the modern approaches too is starting to understand that interconnectedness of all things and just seeing that too within not only the expectation of using winter counts to kind of see where those celestial events are, but it's also something that, like Dr. Howe has said, in other cultures and other groups of people that they've done all along, and it's what, you know, modern scientists do as well. They're always just trying to find the celestial patterns, events that are happening, and observe things in those ways and make sense of it. So I think within that space, there's room for that, and I've seen examples of, you know, exploring interconnectedness not only in science spaces. I remember back to like high school, and like that was my science project, was on a biology project on interdependence of like both plants and animals and like how they depend on one another. So there is examples of that, and even just trying to understand, you know, as a Lakota person, how all things are related to not only to the stars, to the land and ourselves and people. And I think one of the approaches that, you know, modern science, like we might see, is that this spiritual piece of it, or kind of understanding, is not often able to be reflected like in data or in numbers. And that's something too I've had to like balance, because not only, you know, being a STEM instructor, but also as a Lakota person, having to see like both of those narratives and bring them together is something I think that's challenging, but it's a nice way, a critical way of like looking at both in a way, I guess, validating both of those ways of seeing the world, like not only the science piece, but the Lakota science piece and astronomy and the stories that come with that. So I think in modern days too, like there's an approach to this that we do see happening in spaces.
So what are the similarities between Lakota Star Knowledge and modern mainstream cosmology or space science? What do they have in common?
For me, I do think that it's the understanding and observation of both approaches, because like I referred to earlier too, like observing and understanding patterns is something that people have done all along. And these are both just two different ways of looking at that and approaching and understanding and explaining like what we're seeing, the way that we're understanding this. And the same thing with modern scientists. I did a internship too, where I worked with astrobiologists and just seeing like the work that they're doing, and now also like bringing together and finding ways that these two ways of knowing can overlap. helped me to kind of see some of those similarities, but also differences, because there are differences in the way that they do approach that work, whether it's, gathering data to display, how certain stars move, the planets, and in navigating that way as well. And astrobiology itself is all about discovering life's origins, the origin of life, the potential for future life, and how we're going to discover that. And I saw a lot of parallels too in the way that I was taught in understanding our relationship with the stars and going forward, and how that cycle of life comes through too. And I think how Dr. Howe explained too the spiritual connections that we might have within the stars. One of the stories that I grew up with was around like my name and like understanding what Lakota means. So in Lakota culture, we have Lakota naming ceremony, and I got mine like when I was very young. Lots of people get it, I have their naming ceremony later on in life. And I think for me, it was all about like understanding what that means and like how it grounds who I am. And I think a lot of that came with, not only understanding what star knowledge is, but also what modern space science is in terms of my practice as an educator, as a STEM education researcher. And I bring that story with me too, because it was something I reflected on whenever I was interning with astrobiology, and it was a way for me to connect back to, my own understanding, curiosity, and to wanting to learn more about, science, not only from an Indigenous perspective, but also maybe some more of those Western ways of knowing. And in my Lakota name being Wakanajiwi, which means stand sacred woman. And I saw this graphic too that I came across in one of my pieces of literature, and it shows kind of a map of, the Wakan being like the space between the sky, the stars, the earth, and the individual. And for that was like one of the areas where I like pull a lot of my curiosity into wanting to like explore more with both of those.
That is very cool. So and part of the curiosity I had is like in the naming of constellations. Do both modern science and Lakota Star Knowledge name constellations based on the correlation between the Earth and the sky, or how does that come about? Is there a relationship there? Or am I digging too deep?
Right. Well, so yeah, so they're individual, right? And these constellations there's 88 certified and accepted by AAU or AUA, I don't know, the International Astronomical Union, IAU maybe. They have these 88 constellations, period. That's it. And that's part of science, right? Is to systematize and put boundaries around what all falls within Gemini, what all falls within each of these constellations. And Lakotans also had constellations, but not 88. There's only a few, maybe a dozen constellations. And the purpose was not to organize all the sky. I don't think. It seems more like it was just, I like this idea of telling narratives tied, right? Somehow you could use that night sky as equivalent to a winter count, where you have all these glyphs that talk about the histories of the people. You can use the stars at night. You can't see this winter count. Well, you could still see these stars and these constellations. You group them into understandable patterns so that you can remember them. And so, the largest of the Lakotan constellations is called Tayamani, and it spans 3 of the International Astronomical Union constellations. Yeah.
Well, and now that I'm on the subject of constellation, I was wondering if you could just tell us one more story, Dr. Howe, about the Sacred Hoop or the racetrack and that constellation. The Lakota constellation, that consists of a large circle of stars, right? And it reflects onto the Sacred Hoop surrounding the Black Hills. Did I get that right?
Yeah, I've seen that, but we cannot find collaborating evidence other than the one source. And so we do not, as you've seen in our book, Tender Reverence, it is not included because we we can't independently verify that. So,
Okay.
yeah.
So back to we have the similarities between Lakota Star Knowledge and mainstream science. What's the what's the main difference? Is there one particular significant difference between the two? What separates them or makes them unique to each other?
Caitlin, you want to go first or you want me to? Okay. Okay. So I would say the main difference is the purpose.
Mm.
I mean, these are systems of knowledge. Why develop a system of knowledge? You have to have some purpose to you, to your people, to your society, your culture. And so Lakotans, this served their purpose at that time. Now, if they would have had the chance to realize their destiny as a people, it would be different today than it was back in, say, 1860. So that was prohibited by the actions of a larger society. And so science has its purposes, and usually science has, from the beginning, has served, war a lot of times, and this idea of hierarchical and power and control of resources, and that's the root of it, and that's its purpose. That's from Lakotans back in the day, that wasn't important to them. So that, I think that's it. Then what's the purpose of these systems? And they don't overlap then much at all.
Okay, because I wondered if part of along with purpose, when I think of it, I guess the word I come up with is spirituality. Like with Lakota, there seems like there's a spirituality to the stories and the star knowledge, the star narratives, where science doesn't. I mean, they might acknowledge that they're there and they're beautiful, great, but we're not talking about that with science. So it just seems like that there's a little bit of a separation there. Is that kind of accurate, Caitlin? Oh, you're muted. There you go.
Sorry, I was unmuted. Yeah, I think that piece of it is often separated from modern approaches to science as well, because that being one of the guiding pieces of, I feel like, this indigenous specifically Lakota Star Knowledge that's passed on as well, because that being and that's why I kind of shared that story too earlier about the naming piece of it, because that story often, I could share that with scientists, and that approach might not be a way or a guiding curiosity of what they're trying to understand and validate through the data and piece of it. So I think there is a separation there, but I also, like I mentioned earlier, there's lots of bridges and connections to make between the two as well, despite the differences in the spiritual piece and that exclusion of it, often in different science spaces.
Okay. And so we already discussed, Caitlin, that you were an intern with NASA. Can you tell us a little bit about your internship experience?
Yeah, so I did work closely with the astrobiology team, and specifically in a lot of their initiatives with working with Indigenous communities. And this is where too I was looking for an opportunity, because I was teaching at the time, to kind of see a space where I could understand, where is science happening at, because I did a lot of work not only in the state, through I think the American Indian Science and Engineering Society, chapters that we had, and bringing that knowledge to the students, but also wanted to kind of seek out a space to not only practice other skill sets in myself, to navigate science and make it in a real world context for myself and for my students. So I was teamed up with the astrobiology team, and the work just aligned perfectly, because my mentor, she works closely with different Indigenous communities. So a lot of it, the work was traveling and seeing the relationship she had ongoing and built. And one of them just happened to be to a budding relationship with the Rosebud reservation and some individuals there that both my mentor and myself knew. But I was able to see kind of, the centering of these, the knowledge that is built within our different communities. And one of them was the Navajo Nation, and the educators there, and just building a network of people that are bringing in community knowledge and centering that first. And then also those relationships that we're starting to build with scientists. Was also able to go to like a teepees and telescopes event in Canada where they organize Wilfred Buck, one of, I think he's known as the Star Guy. He's a indigenous, star knowledge keeper for his people, and he brought in around him, he brought in lots of stories. And then there was also the astronomy societies that were local to bring in, telescopes. So there was like lots of learning resources and opportunities from both of those areas. So it was really cool to kind of see those spaces in areas where, they are centering, indigenous ways of knowing and knowledge systems, but also like showing those relationships that are starting to be built. Because I think that's one of the areas too, is that it's, this area of, I guess, research and science too doesn't always have the best relationship within indigenous communities. So there's kind of a healing or ongoing work to rebuild those relationships. And it was cool to be able to see that through that experience.
Okay, thank you. So you're a STEM educator, Caitlin. How can Lakota Star Knowledge and other indigenous teachings as well be incorporated into STEM education? Yeah. And I know that's something that you're working diligently on, so I'm excited to hear what you have to tell us.
Yeah, I've had lots of experiences within South Dakota too, just the opportunities to bring in, and even if it is in spaces where we're doing research with, like one of the examples was at Lakota Tech, we worked with a group from South Dakota School of Mines on a high altitude ballooning project. And we had a group of our students from Lakota Tech, myself, and then some other students from across the state work together on this team. And we did a launching during the eclipse. And of course, there's different teachings around the eclipse too. So it was really cool to be able to see the respect given to some of our Lakota relatives that didn't feel comfortable on launch day, or that was just not part of something that they wanted to be, especially outside. There's lots of beliefs around that. And then one of the areas we went down to visit, especially to kind of see the eclipse a little bit closer with our data collection, was in Navajo lands as well. So it was cool to be able to connect with local people there and kind of center their knowledge and ways of knowing. So I think just like opportunities like that to bring in, because a teacher is only one person, and sometimes the students have a lot of that knowledge. There's other people in the community that might have knowledge as well to be able to support some of the learning that happens. And yeah, I taught STEM, so it was high school age students, and we were at a career and technical education school as well. So one of the areas I often, we're a Lakota school too, built off of Lakota virtues. So a lot of our career and technical classes, we encourage educators to seek out community to be a part of that process too, to make sure that, what we're teaching, the context, the relevancy is important to the community and the students and their families. And some of the classes I taught were like engineering design, computer science, and a lot of those areas, at first, it's about, learning this new language in different ways. So I think centering something that's context to them, like a real world issue or example of where that might show up in their community, is helpful. So yeah, those are just some examples there.
Okay, so what do you think are some ways to like combine education, culture, and STEM in, say, a subject like mathematics? Like, is there, for someone who's really wanting to meld the three pieces together, what are some suggestions for doing that?
Yeah, I think that this approach too, I worked at the school too. I was specifically in the STEM department, but we had the science and math teachers come in, and we shared ideas as well, because it was something, we were all working towards. And yeah, a lot of my coworkers, co-teachers were non-native as well, so wanting to explore and see different areas, especially in South Dakota, where we have the Ochedi Shakoi essential understandings like in those standards. And a lot of from just being in different educational systems, I know people had either hesitation because they think, you know, or don't feel comfortable saying like this knowledge is something I can share within those spaces. So if I were, yeah, mathematics teacher wanting to kind of pull those areas together, I think one of the spaces to start is I think with the community itself, or just kind of seeing what knowledge, you know, may be passed on, connecting with students and kind of seeing what interests they have as well. And just seeing different ways that you can maybe tie in mathematics with the culture and community, but also like just understanding, you know, what does math look like, you know, for their culture, for their community, because there is this Lakota like math, you know, system too that is different or has different approaches to the ways we understand math as well. And so specifically for my context, I was in STEM education, so we were always integrating and bringing in like the science piece, technical skills needed, engineering, you know, methods that we might use within our projects. But also we had math was a piece of it too. So sometimes that just naming it and kind of being aware that, you know, this math is how we're understanding or approaching, you know, this issue within STEM. But yeah, I think I would just start there within that space and building out, because a lot of times I think in math too, I'm thinking of like even word problems and things like that, and making it context specific is something that educators do often. And then also like building projects around that, whether it's, you know, through design, you know, there's lots of geometry that goes into the designs that we have in Lakota culture and in artwork that is passed on. So that being an area in computer science, which is often, I guess, a sister or in relationship with mathematics, was something I taught in with a lot of numbers and kind of understanding patterns in ways that we do see that. That was an area too I saw potential, and we did lots of work with that too when we were looking at binary numbers and like how those systems work. One of the examples we did around that was we had like this big parachute from, it was a real parachute that was used for one of the Mars expeditions. And they showed like these different patterns that they used binary to, you know, write out, I think it was the specific location where it was launched from. And then also had like a message within that space. And we compared that parachute design to quill work, because we saw, you know, there was similar patterns. And so the students like designed like their own message if they were to, you know, launch their parachute as well. So there's lots of opportunities, I think, within that math space.
That sounds amazing. I really like that idea. I do want to open it up again really quick for anyone who has any questions. Please, by all means, share your questions, your comments, anything.
Stacy, there was an earlier question. I think it got scrolled over, but Kurt asked, do you still offer a seminar at your facility?
Kurt, hello.
Hey,
Been a long time since
been a while, Frank.
yeah, Yanni wash day, I guess. But
Yeah, you got more hair than I got less.
right. That's right. Although above your lip you have quite a bit, I think, don't you? But yes, we do not offer the workshops such as you participated on at Wing Springs anymore. No.
Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
It was awesome to treat.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Lori, go ahead.
I have a couple of questions. One is I listened online to a Dr. Annette Lee from St. Cloud University, and she talked about a lot of, she's also a physicist in physiology, but she talked a lot about quantum physics and the relationship with indigenous star knowledge. And because it's so tribally focused, I'm wondering if there's a coordination of efforts among educators to bring forward the stories of different tribal communities in a unique way that's meaningful to that population. And then my second question was, we're sitting in the middle of quantum physics trying to understand the meaning of life with that Sanford research lab sitting smack dab in the middle of the Black Hills. And I can't get my head around, sacred space and Lakota knowledge, and then, all of these resources there, and wondering if there's any connection. Okay, I'll take it offline. Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Caitlin, you want to start?
Sure. I love that you shared that, Lori, too, about the Sanford Underground Lab, because I remember the first time I learned about that too. I could not believe that we had this large lab in the Black Hills, and I was thinking, I just can't believe like the destruction that was made, but then also the science that's being done too. So I had like mixed feelings about it, and also had a mentor there, Peggy Norris, who worked with us on that high altitude ballooning project, and she's a physicist herself. Not native, but she's very respectful in that work as well. So yeah, it's interesting to always hear. And I'm happy you mentioned Annette Lee too, because I've been inspired by her work, and I came across the documentary she did too in working with some Dakota youth and understanding, how their artwork translates into and transfers, knowledge over time. Not only from the stories that are shared in what the art means, but it was really cool to hear that too. But yeah, it's weird to be able to like understand like those spaces, because yeah, Sanford is somewhere where, I go and tour, and also this coming summer, we're taking some youth from Rosebud area to go in camp and stay in the Black Hills, and we're going to do some of the storytelling around some of those sites and their connections to the star patterns in Sanford. Also during the museum in Rapid City are some places we're expected to go and visit as well. But I know there has been, Lakota people that have worked at the Sanford Underground Lab and have like these diverse perspectives. I heard known like some friends that have worked there, and they leave just, because they have like that mixed feeling and not really sure if that is somewhere that, they feel comfortable in working, I guess, passing on that knowledge. But also people who have been respected in knowing that there's like I think they have the community garden now too. So Rochelle Zen, I think, is also a good resource. She's Lakota, and she works there and does a lot of community engagement as well to share kind of some of those bridges of stories.
Dr. Howe, do you have any thoughts on that?
And can you repeat the first part of the question? I'm sorry.
I just had two questions, and one is there a coordination among educators in the region, to bring out that, for lack of a better word, indigenous star knowledge that's unique to the different tribal communities? And then the second one was just your thoughts and feelings on the Sanford Research Lab in the sacred Black Hills.
Yeah. Those things that happen in the Black Hills, and not just the lab, but all that has gone on in the last 150 years or so, it's just from a Lakotan perspective, a traditional Lakotan perspective, those are problematic. But this is life, and people have to adjust and adapt and push back when we can, and accept, when the way things are. And so, yeah, it's a problem having that lab there, I think. But before that, it was the gold mine. And it seems this has less detrimental effect on the environment, perhaps, yeah, we don't know for sure. And as far as the interrelationships, usually it's the outsiders that want all this information. And so I hope, and I'm not part of any of that, but I hope these tribal communities, these tribes and tribal colleges and these type of institutions within tribes hold on to that as strong as they can. I don't know quite what the purpose would be to do that, but people just want, and it's like, what's the reciprocal agreement? What's the give and take here? Why should we build these relationships? What's the pattern? What's the history? How are we going to do this going forward? And this is that kind of idea of knowledge sovereignty, or this what is yours and what's ours, and science is not Lakotan, right? I mean, I I want to say Lakotans can be scientists, but scientists can't by choice be Lakotans, right? So it's not a fair comparison there. And that's what I like about these. One thing I like about these traditional stories and why we really rely on academic and scholarly approaches is these were astute observers. That's what science promotes. And whether it's in history or astronomy or medicine, being an astute observer and a critical thinker, that's it. And that can translate, and we can see that evident in Lakotan astronomy. So that's where I think that crossover is, and where we can learn and apply that knowledge that we learned from that scientific method and see how it parallels it in some ways. Just being someone that's going to operate and live in this Great Plains area and had to do it for millennia.
And from what I was reading as well, there's American ACES chapters that's Advancing Indigenous Peoples in, Advancing Indigenous People in STEM. And it's a collaborative effort with educators and students, I believe. There's 12 chapters in South Dakota, 4 are at universities, 8 are in K-12, or there'd be high school level, I suppose. Caitlin, do you know any more information about that? And other opportunities for STEM educators and students to collaborate or provide greater exposure and awareness of Indigenous knowledge within the STEM community?
Yeah, ACES is a great resource too. Not only, with the local chapters, there was School of Mines came down to our school and supported us in a couple of different ways, but I believe that their mentor, or from the last time I was there, changed out too. But those are great resources just to connect with local mentors and build those relationships. And then I put 2 in a chat here too that I came across. Sichongo has an island group too. You have educators in the summer they're specifically working on Star Knowledge and centering that work within the curriculum that they're using to teach in Rosebud. So I think that happens towards the end of summer. So if there's any information on that that comes about, we can share that as well.
And what's the link, the circlesalliance.org? What's that link?
Oh yeah, so this one too, it was something in my research, I know a couple of the people too that are a part of this alliance, some of them being from Sanford Underground Lab, and they're just from different institutions, and it looks like a group that they bring together to provide PD and just spaces to understand and relate. So there's some events there too that I wanted to explore a little bit more too. I just thought it might be of interest.
Thank you for sharing those links and that information with us. There's a lot to be looked at and a lot to be admired in the Indigenous star knowledge realm, and how that relates to not just to modern day science, but to everyday life for all of us. I think it's fascinating for anybody who hasn't looked into it. It's kind of what I call a rabbit hole for me, because once I started looking at it, it's like I just cannot stop looking at everything and seeing the relationship between this knowledge and our everyday life, and how it can apply to all of us, and how it's beneficial, and it's beautiful. It's beautiful, and it's beneficial. So highly recommend it. We are out of time for today's cafe. I do want to thank everybody for joining us and invite you back to have lunch with us again at the cafe in a couple of weeks. On April 11th, we're going to have Dr. Daniel Morlum and Dr. Kyle Copland join us to talk about the ongoing issue of South Dakota's teacher shortage. So if you'd like to join us, I welcome you all back. In the meantime, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week, and we'll hopefully see you in a couple of weeks. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.